Hello, everyone. I feel kind of silly sitting in my house doing a lecture. Okay. Hopefully, everyone has now watched the Andrew Jackson video online, which I know wasn't a great video, probably a little too positive about Andrew Jackson, but it made the major points about Andrew Jackson. So that was an overview of the Jacksonian period. So if you remember in class, we talked about Jefferson and a little bit about the Jeffersonian period, from the election of 1800 through the purchase of the Louisiana Territory. What we didn't talk about were things like the War of 1812, which was the second war with England that we win. Not much really happens with that war. We just beat England again. And it was kind of the era of good feelings, where everyone got along. We saw no political differences for the most part, except for one that we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes. There was one big, ugly moment in 1820 that dealt with slavery. But then everything changed in 1824. And that was a very ugly election, where John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson basically tied. And the House decided to go with John Quincy Adams for president. And then the 1828 election, as you saw in the video, was when Andrew Jackson won. And he brought a lot of changes to Washington, a lot of changes to the White House. Also a lot of changes to Georgia. I don't think the video talks much about this, but the area where we are at, southwest Georgia, a lot of that area became part of the U.S. because of Andrew Jackson removing Native Americans. Anyway, 1840 is basically the end of the Jacksonian period. And this starts a period that sometimes we call the antebellum period. Ante means before, bellum referring to war, the period before the war, the 20 years leading up to the Civil War. Now, when Andrew Jackson was president, Martin Van Buren became his vice president. There was a big scandal, a sex scandal, with a woman named Peggy Eaton. And there's also a big debate over nullification that you saw in the video. The result of that was the Vice President John C. Calhoun leaving office, and Andrew Jackson's campaign manager, Martin Van Buren, became the Vice President. Martin Van Buren was from New York. He had been a slave owner. He owned one slave who later ran away. But other than John Adams and John Quincy Adams, still every single president up to this point has been a slave owner. Slave owning was very much a part of power in the United States, especially in the middle states like New York, New Jersey, Delaware, although by now New York and New Jersey have gotten rid of slavery, and definitely in the southern states. And again, that issue of slavery is going to become the issue in the United States in the next few years. Anyway, Martin Van Buren becomes president in the 1836 election, and in 1837, the Second National Bank goes away. You might remember from the video. Andrew Jackson wanted to slay the dragon of the bank, and he does. It finally goes away in 1837, and the moment it goes away, a major economic depression sets in. To get rid of a president, a lot of times you think, I don't like a particular president. How can we get this guy out of here? The way to get rid of a president is the economy. More than anything else, people vote with their pocketbooks. Sex scandals don't work. Unpopular wars don't work. The economy works. Horrible, horrible, horrible economy in 1837, 1838. Not surprisingly, 1840, Martin Van Buren is voted out. And a guy named William Henry Harrison is voted in. Now, you notice by Van Buren's name, it has a big D for Democrat. By William Henry Harrison's name, you see a big W. This is our first second party. We had Democrats, Democratic Republicans. Now they're just called Democrats. Democrats go back to the beginning. Then we had Federalists, but Federalists went away in 1814. They just disappeared. The party just fell apart. For the first time, we have a second political party, the Whigs, W-H-I-G-S, Whig. It's an old English word. It actually means outlaw. That was the original term. But in England in the 1700s, A Whig was somebody who wanted to curb, to lessen the power of a king. That was what a Whig did. And if you remember from the video, people who didn't like Andrew Jackson referred to him as King Andrew. Sometimes they called him a dictator. So this was a political party who didn't like Jackson, even though Jackson's no longer president. That's their idea. They don't like Jackson. They're the Whigs. And they actually get a guy elected, William Henry Harrison. But he doesn't last very long. Back then, you were voted in November, but you didn't become president until March 4th. Today, it's January. Back then, it was March. It would be March until 1937, in fact. So, he's inaugurated in March 1841. He gives an inauguration speech. It's nearly 3 hours long. It's raining. It's cold. He gets pneumonia, and he dies 3 weeks later. He's our first president to die in office. And the original Constitution is not completely clear on what you do when that happens. How do you handle that? I mean, today we would say, oh, the vice president becomes president. Well, back then, the vice president, by the way, was John Tyler, the guy you see at the bottom of the screen. Back then, they weren't really sure did that make John Tyler actually the president, or was he just acting president? Was he just sort of a temporary president? The argument was we elected Harrison as president, and we elected Tyler as vice president. We didn't elect Tyler as president. And so there was a huge debate of whether or not Tyler is actually the president or not. Today, by the way, it's very clear. It's in the, we've amended the Constitution to make it very clear. It wasn't clear at the time. And oddly, Tyler didn't actually want to be president. He was just one of those strange politicians that was fine being vice president. But nonetheless, he eventually becomes the president. And what's interesting is that Tyler ran with Harrison. He was technically a Whig, but he behaved like a Democrat, which is why you see the big D by his name. He really acted like a president. It revealed that the Whig Party wasn't a very strong party. If you're in a political party and you only have one issue, that's not much of a party. Their one issue is we don't like Jackson, and we don't like anybody that's connected with Jackson. That's their party, which really shows that it's not much of a party. There's not a lot of common ground other than they just don't like Andrew Jackson. And so ironically, there's all these Whigs in Congress, and they put all these bills through, and Tyler actually, vetoed a lot of them. Because remember, in the video, Andrew Jackson, that was his big thing, is that he started using the veto power in a big way, and every president since then has done the same thing. All of that's really just to lead up to one thing. Because you might be thinking, well, how does this lead to the Civil War? What in the world does this have to do with the Civil War, all this detail? Really, it's only one thing. Texas. This is all about Texas. Right at the end, because Tyler doesn't even try to run for re-election. He doesn't even want to. Again, he didn't really want to be president. So, in early 1845, right before he's going to move on, quit being president, a guy named James Polk is going to be the next president. Right before that happens, Tyler annexes Texas. Annex means to bring into the Union. And in fact, it was almost immediately turned into a U.S. state. Again, you might be thinking, so what? What does Texas have to do again with the Civil War? Well, the problem with Texas is this. Texas was a Mexican state. A lot of people don't realize that Mexico is actually the United States of Mexico. That's its actual name. And it's actually comprised, I think today it's about 37, 38 states. I don't, I'll look it up on Google right now to make sure I'm right. But back then it had a few more states. There was a whole bunch of northern Mexico that's not part of Mexico anymore. For instance, they had a state of California. They had a state called New Mexico. And they had a state called Texas. Well, back in the 1820s, Mexico became an independent country. They fought a war against Spain, just like we did against England, and they become an independent country. And they needed people to move into northern Mexico. There weren't a lot of people there. There were some Native Americans, but not a lot of people. So they invited Americans in. Of course, they were thinking Americans would come into places like Texas, and they would become Mexican citizens. So a lot of people from the South, a lot of plantation owners, especially young ones who were just starting out, they had just bought a bunch of slaves and they were ready to make a bunch of money, they began to move into Texas. And their assumption was that one day Texas will be part of the United States anyway. So they do that. Then in 1828, Mexico outlaws slavery. It's interesting that in a couple of ways, Mexico beats the United States. We kind of pride ourselves on a country of freedom, a country that got rid of slavery, but we were one of the last countries to do that. When we got rid of slavery, there were only three places in the world that still had slavery: Cuba, Brazil, and us. We were really late in the game on this. So Mexico gets rid of slavery in 1828. All of those American slave owners living in Texas, growing cotton in Texas, they weren't too happy about this. They were furious. In fact, that's the whole reason they moved to Texas. So, over the next few years, they start staging a rebellion. And in 1836, they declared themselves the Republic of Texas, an independent country. We, the United States, recognized Texas as being independent. Mexico did not. And for several years, nothing happened. That was it. Nothing happened. Until 1845, when Tyler declares Texas to be part of the United States. Not surprisingly, Mexico is not happy about this. And there's going to be a war over this. So, now we're into the build-up to the Civil War. So just like with the American Revolution, we're going to go through all the steps, the big steps, that led to the Civil War. And, the election of 1840, and eventually John Tyler, and the annexation of Texas, leads to the first real build-up to the Civil War, the Mexican-American War. It's another one of these little wars that people have forgotten about. And, generally speaking, we're always sort of on the right side of war, except this one. There's a reason why we don't celebrate this war very often. This is the one American war that we kind of sometimes wish we could forget about. Because it is a war of conquest. We, the United States, usually don't do wars of conquest, where we invade another country just to take their land. We don't do that. Other countries do that. We don't. Except here. Here, we really do. So we took Texas. Mexico was not happy about that. By that point, by the time, that's over with, James Polk is president, another Democrat. He was called Young Hickory because Andrew Jackson was known as Old Hickory, the tough old guy. That term goes all the way back to the War of 1812. Well, James Polk was very similar to Andrew Jackson. They were friends. In fact, Andrew Jackson was alive right at the beginning of James Polk's presidency. In fact, you saw those photographs in the video of Andrew Jackson at this time. He advised James Polk, and everybody knew that. In fact, in other ways, you can see people, they really would like Jackson to be president again. People liked Jackson. They flirted with the Whigs for a short period. They don't like the Whigs. Boom, they want to go back to Jackson. So they get the next best thing, James Polk. He's very similar to Jackson. James Polk's an interesting president because he's the only president to actually do everything he set out to do. He won't run for re-election, by the way. He'll serve one term because at the end of his term, he's like, I did it. I did everything I said I was going to do. Anyway, James Polk's plan was to expand the United States from coast to coast. Texas for him was only part of it. He wanted the rest of northern Mexico. He wanted California. He wanted New Mexico. Excuse me. And so he sends some soldiers down to Texas, because that's ours now. There was a real dispute between us and Mexico. Now, not only whether or not we should get Texas, but how big Texas is. We had a particular southern border. Mexico claimed that that border was a little further north. So there's a part of Texas that was, if you will, disputed. And so he sent soldiers into that disputed area, trying to provoke a fight, and it worked. The Mexican army attacked our army. A couple people were killed. Therefore, James Polk could then go to Congress and say, American blood has been spilled on American soil. We have to take revenge. Congress declares war, and really within months, the war is over with. As you can see, the dates are a couple of years. Most of that time was negotiation. The war itself was very, very quick. We could have taken over all of Mexico. In fact, uh, the military, including the Marines, marched right into Mexico City. If you know the Marine Corps hymn, it starts, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. This is the halls of Montezuma. We literally marched into Mexico City. And we almost took over the entire country of Mexico. Fortunately for everybody, we decided not to take all of Mexico. It would have been a disaster. And we wouldn't have survived it. But we did take northern Mexico. And in a minute, I'll show you a map of what that territory was. We did officially pay for it. We paid about $15 million for it. But we did it after we took it. It's, like I said, it's still the war that doesn't look real good. Mexico to this day still, they're still not happy about this. And that's why it is kind of ironic. We talk a lot about Mexican immigration into Texas and into California. But if you go to Texas or California, you will meet many, many Mexican Americans. But a large number of them will not have been immigrants because there were thousands and thousands of people, 50,000 Mexicans in New Mexico alone. A lot of people have been here the whole time. In fact, if you ask some of these families, hey, when did you come to the U.S.? They will smile and say, we didn't come to the U.S. The U.S. came to us. Anyway, the real issue here is what do we do with all this land? Who gets this land? Is it going to be is it going to be slave land or is it going to be free land? So what land are we talking about when we talk about this land? Well, here's a map of the United States around this time. As you can see, you can see the pink area is the part that we got from the American Revolution. The yellow area of Florida, we get that from Spain in 1821. Then you got the Louisiana Territory. Then you got the area of Texas that we annexed. As you can see, it's not quite what Texas still is today. It's a little slightly different boundaries. We also got Oregon, by the way. England finally said, okay, you guys can get Oregon. Pope did that as well. And then you can see what we got from Mexico, what's called the Mexican secession. And then we did buy there's a little bit of stuff that we bought from Mexico a little bit later, way down at the bottom. But as you can see, by the time of James Polk, pretty much all of what is now the United States, we own. I mean, James Polk actually does it. He gets Texas, he gets the rest of Southwest U.S., and he gets Oregon. So that one president, again, practically doubled the size of the United States. But the area we got from Mexico, this is the area we're talking about. I mean, these are the current states that we got from Mexico. California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, all of these come from Mexico, or at least partly from Mexico. And that sparks the debate. Again, we have all this land. What do we do with it? Who lives here? Is slavery going to be here or not? And this is why the Mexican-American War is part of the buildup to the Civil War. The Civil War, yes, it's a very complex issue. There are issues about states' rights. There's issues over the Constitution. But just like a wheel, you think of a wheel. You got the hub, and then you got these spokes coming out of the hub of a wheel. If you take the hub out, the wheel collapses. That's the Civil War. And the hub of the Civil War is slavery. Everything springs out of this issue of slavery. It's funny that today people don't want to admit that. There are a lot of people, it's not about slavery. And I don't quite get why that's the case. But if you just look at the time period, that is the overwhelming issue of the period. And that debate really, really starts with the Mexican-American War and who's going to get that land, slave owners or non-slave owners. So the second step is something called the Wilmot Proviso. David Wilmot was from Pennsylvania. He was a brand new member of the House of Representatives. I mean, he literally just arrived. By the way, there was another young guy who just arrived at the U.S. House of Representatives from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln served one term in the House of Representatives, and at the same time that David Wilmot was there. In fact, later as president, he'll talk a lot about David Wilmot. If you're a Republican, He is the founder of the Republican Party. He is the beginning of Republicans, by the way. But at this time, he wasn't Republican. Republicans weren't around yet. Anyway, when you end the war, you know it takes a while. You don't just stop fighting. You have to pay off soldiers. You have to pay off the other country. You have to get the guys home. It takes a long time to end the war. So Congress is ending the war. They're debating about how to stop this war. And how to, they're talking about the 15 million we're going to pay Mexico. During this, David Wilmot, who had just arrived, and usually people who just arrive at Congress don't say anything. There's a sense that you have to learn the ropes for a while. So he raises his hand and he asks to speak. And everyone's kind of surprised. Like, what's this guy doing? Okay, let's let the new guy speak. And in about 30 seconds, Wilmot completely changes American history. It's one of those unforgotten moments. He stands up and he says, I want to add a proviso to this war bill. Proviso just needed a little addition, an addendum, an amendment to the bill, in other words. He said, the bill is the bill to end the war. He says, I want to add a proviso that says that none of the territory that we got from Mexico, that none of that can be slaves, that it has to all be free. Immediately, there's outcry in Congress. People start yelling. People are screaming. The reason why is that he mentioned slavery. Slavery was not supposed to be talked about in Congress. Again, slavery has always divided us, going all the way back to the U.S. Constitution. There's always been a debate over slavery. But in the 1830s, they got kind of bad. John Quincy Adams had been president. Then he was voted out in 1828. John Quincy Adams then became a representative of Congress, which is the only time that's ever happened. And when he was in Congress, every single day, John Quincy Adams would give a speech about how terrible slavery was, and it would make people mad. Just like in a marriage or a friendship, there's certain issues you just don't talk about. Because if you talk about them, everyone's going to argue. So you don't talk about them. That was slavery. And in fact, Congress decided to have a gag order about slavery. In other words, you're not allowed to talk about it. If somebody brings up slavery, this is what's supposed to happen. Congress will stop. They'll immediately have a vote on whether or not to talk about it. And if they vote it down, you don't talk about it anymore. And a couple of times, people have brought up slavery. They've held a vote, and they've always voted it down. The real reason was just to shut John Quincy Adams up, because he was making everybody mad about talking about slavery. But it was still in effect. Anyway, so when Wilmot said this, immediately, they were screaming, they were yelling. They immediately held a vote of whether or not to keep talking about it. And for the first time, Congress voted to keep talking about slavery. This is a key moment. Now, by the way, they added this to the bill. The House voted for it, but the Senate took it out. Wilmot will bring this up every year for the next couple of years, and every single time it will get shut down. It never passes. By the way, Wilmot will be taken, he's actually invited to the White House, and James Polk sits him down and says, basically, what the hell are you doing? You keep talking about this slave stuff, we're going to have a civil war in our hands. You need to quit talking about this. So even in the 1840s, there was a recognition that this is going to be the issue that we will fight over. It's that divisive of an issue. By the way, James Polk also slave owner. So he also was personally upset. I mean, James Polk, that's partly why he wants that territory. He is looking to expand the southern economy. This is also a key moment, because not only is the issue slavery on the table again, and by the way, the issues here, it's never going away now. It was brought up in the 30s, it was brought up in the 1820s, it was brought up during the Constitution, but it always went away. From this point on, it never goes away. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But the other key moment here that I want you to be aware of is that when they voted whether or not to talk about slavery, every Southern representative voted to not talk about it. Most of the other representatives voted to talk about it. Now, this is kind of key. You want to know, why did the South break away in 1861? The main reason is slavery. But related to that is this other issue. When we first started as a nation, 13 colonies, 13 states. Half we would consider southern, the other half we might consider northern. Even by the 1820s, 1830s, half of the states were slave states, southern slave states, and half of them were free. But now we're growing westward, and it's becoming clear to some of these southern leaders that they're starting to become outnumbered. And if they become outnumbered, that means that whether or not they vote for slavery, the rest of the country can vote to get rid of slavery. So they break away in 1861 to preserve slavery, not just because they want to keep slavery, but also they want to maintain their power. The South had a lot of power because they were half the country. But now they're starting to realize they're not half the country anymore. They're no longer a majority. You know, they're starting to become a minority. And so this is a warning. It's not, we're not there yet, but this is a warning that before too long the South may truly become a minority. That slave owners will not have all the power anymore. But up to now, slave owners had a lot of power. Okay. Now, Wilmot's Proviso comes up, we argue over it. However, most people consider this not that big of a deal. You know, like so many issues today, you know it's an issue, but at the same time, you can ignore it and, big deal, you can just deal with it down the line. Social Security, whether you agree with it or not agree with it. As I'm getting older, I kind of like Social Security because I'm collecting it in 20 years. But we all know that there's a problem with Social Security. I mean, we're going to have to do something to keep it going. But we know that's 30 or 40 years from now. That's not tomorrow. So we talk about it, that's a big issue, but one day. Or pollution. Yeah, pollution's bad, global warming's bad, but, it's not tomorrow, so we'll deal with it one day. And that's what we tend to do. I always use the image of a football. We punt it forward. Let the next generation deal with this issue. We don't have to deal with it. They can deal with it. That was slavery. Everyone knows that at some point we're going to have to deal with it. There's going to come a point where either we're a slave country or we're not a slave country. And what are we going to be? But every time everybody's like, well, we'll deal with it next time. And that was David Wilmot's Proviso. Just down the line. Maybe in 20 years we'll deal with that. All that land's way out west. No one's going to be living out there for a long time. But then all that changed. Because gold was discovered in California. In 1848, gold was discovered near a little mission town called St. Francis. We know it as San Francisco. That was an old Spanish mission town. That only had a few hundred people living there. By 1849, thousands and thousands of people are coming to California. They're coming from Texas. They're coming from New York, from Georgia, from Florida, from Europe. And they're coming, as you can see in this image, they're coming from places like China. This is actually the beginning of Chinese immigration to the United States. It's interesting. This is kind of the beginning of real immigration, something we're still dealing with. Up till now, we didn't have many immigrants. We had people of African heritage, but they weren't new ones coming in all the time. We had some Native Americans, of course. They weren't part of the U.S., though. And we had quite a few English, Scottish, French, a little bit of Germans, and also in 1848, some Irish are beginning to come in. So Irish and Chinese immigrants were really kind of our first real immigrants, if you will. But that's a U.S. 2 issue. We won't talk about that now. So gold was the big thing. San Francisco goes almost overnight from a little tiny town to a city with millions of dollars of gold. And that means one thing. California has to become a state. It just has to become a state. But that brings up the question. Is it going to be a free state or is it going to be a slave state? That's the question. In other words, this issue that we thought we could deal with 20 years from now, we have to deal with it right now. There is no waiting 20 years now. There are a couple of problems with California. One is, if California becomes a free state, that means there will be more free states than there are slave states. Why does that matter? Well, we'll deal with that in just a moment, but there's an imbalance. The other problem is the size of California. I know it's hard to do. You can't see my finger, obviously, but if you see Virginia, North Carolina, you see the boundary between Virginia and North Carolina. If you kind of take your finger and go across the screen, you notice it's pretty much a straight shot for the most part. New Mexico kind of screws it up a little bit, but basically it's a straight shot all the way to California. That line basically was the dividing line between slavery and freedom. Even though you have places like Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and Kentucky, and Missouri, those orange states, even though you see some places above that line, from 1820 on, that line was the line that said nothing above that line can be slave except for the stuff that's already there. And anything below that line could be slave. It's called the Missouri Compromise. In 1820, Missouri was going to become a state. Some people wanted it to be free. Some people wanted it to be slave. We came close to fighting over that, by the way. They decided that they compromised. They decided that Missouri could be slave, but from now on, nothing above that line can be slavery. That's called the Missouri Compromise, the 1820 Compromise. Okay? The problem with California is it's above and below that line. So that's a problem. And the fact that if it comes in as a slave state or a free state, either way, it's going to upset the balance. There was some talk of dividing California up, but that really wasn't taken very seriously. So California's got to be a state. There's no getting around it. And no matter which way it goes, free or slave, that's going to make somebody mad. So there's some sticking points here. There are some things we got to resolve. And so here's some sticking points. Imbalance between free and slave states. Why does that matter? Well, very simple. If you're a slave state, and there are 13 other slave states, and there are 8 free states, well, you know what? Every time a bill comes into Congress to free slaves, you guys are going to outvote them. It's going to be 14-8. But if it's reversed, if you have 16 free states and only 15 slave states, and somebody introduces the bill to get rid of slavery, 15 slave states all vote against it, but 16 free states could all vote for it, and they win, because it is a democracy. So slave states, that's why they're nuts about keeping that balance. Free states weren't as worried about that, but the slave states were. They were really, that was their big issue. We've got to keep the balance. California will make it imbalanced. That's a big problem. There are other issues, just like when you have an argument today with a wife or a husband or a friend. You argue about one thing, but then other things come up. Small issues that, well, since we're arguing anyway, I might as well bring this up too. Same thing here. So we're starting to argue about slavery, but there's some other little issues here. For instance, Washington. Washington, D.C. is not part of any state, but there were slaves in Washington. In fact, most of Washington was built by slaves. White House, built by slaves. Congress, built by slaves. The original Supreme Court, built by slaves. Half of the Washington Monument, built by slaves. I say half because the Washington Monument wasn't finished when the Civil War began. It only was finished after the Civil War. If you ever look at the Washington Monument, you can tell because the bricks are 2 different colors. I think the bottom ones are lighter colors than the top. I think I got that right. Than the top ones. So D.C. has always had slaves. I mean, it's in the heart of the slave South. A lot of people didn't like slavery there. They thought, if you think about it, it looks terrible. We're a free country. All men are created equal. That's where people from other countries go to. Imagine a visitor coming to Washington, D.C., and then looking over to the right and seeing human beings being sold in a market. And usually, slaves were sold naked. They were paraded around like animals. Maybe you look over to your left and you see another person being whipped, brutally whipped. I mean, that's the reality of slavery. Whether or not you like slavery or not, it looks bad. Speaking, obviously everybody today doesn't like slavery, but I mean at the time, whether or not you were a slave supporter or not, even slave supporters agreed that it kind of looked bad in D.C., that maybe you want to hide some of that. But here's the problem. Here's the problem. You can see this written at the bottom there. When I say the South, by the way, I keep saying the South. The South, when I say that, I mean the slave South. What I mean are slave owners. Because obviously slaves are in the South. They don't agree with this. Even a lot of small farmers who weren't slave owners didn't agree with all of this. When I say the South, I do mean those big slave owners is who I'm talking about. Anyway, those guys, they don't want Congress deciding. Because again, D.C. doesn't have really its own government. You know, Congress would have to make that decision. But if Congress can make the decision about D.C., what's to stop Congress from then making the decision about Georgia tomorrow? In other words, it's what we call a slippery slope. You know, you start with one issue, and then it blossoms into a much bigger issue. So again, if Congress votes to get rid of slavery in D.C., that sets up a precedent. They've done it once. What's to stop them from doing it again? And so the South, the slave-owning South, doesn't want to give in on this issue. They don't want Congress getting rid of slavery in D.C., even though they don't always agree with that. You know, even a lot of slave owners agreed that it probably shouldn't be right there in D.C., but they don't want Congress doing it. That sets up a bad precedent as far as they are concerned. There's also one other issue. Way back at the beginning of our nation, Congress passed a bill called the Fugitive Slave Law. Fugitive slave is a slave that has run away. And since constitutionally, legally, slaves were still considered property, it is the role of the government to preserve people's property. So this law instructs states that they have to return slaves if they run away. Well, of course, by 1850, you know, that was a pretty big thing. You know, slaves running away to Pennsylvania or to Ohio or Illinois. And the people would help those slaves, maybe even go all the way up to Canada, which didn't have slavery. In other words, people were ignoring the fugitive slave law. Now, again, today we would think that's great. They were helping slaves become free. But at the time, for slave owners, they were furious. They said, this is a federal law, and they need to enforce that. And I want you to keep that in mind. Notice the slave South wants the federal government to be more powerful. That, you know, this is something that's going to come up a couple times. When it comes to slavery, the South is not consistent. If it helps slavery, they're all for the federal government. But if it hurts slavery, then suddenly they don't like the federal government. You know, again, it all revolves around slavery. So anyway, that's another issue. They want a tougher slave law. So there are some real sticking points here. How do you handle this? So as you can see, you know, it's not just about Texas or California. This is really getting more and more a much larger issue about what are we? You know, and it's funny that, by the way, they did use the term empire back then. We don't use that term today, but that's the term they would have used. Are we an empire of liberty, or are we an empire of slavery? If you think about it, it's kind of that debate. What are we looking at as our guidance? The Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, that ideal, the Founding Brothers ideal, liberty, independence, freedom, or are we kind of taking the more of that Founding Fathers ideal, which is a little more like just the Constitution, where we have a free society, but it's a ranked society, where we have kind of people on top and people on the bottom. I mean, that's what we're kind of talking about here, that same debate we've seen from the very beginning of what are we in the end, free or not free. But as I've said already, slavery is the issue. It used to be about tariffs. It was about national banks, or about whether or not to build roads or canals, what we call internal improvement. These are things that divided us earlier. But now all that's been cleared away. The smoke is cleared, and there's only one real issue there. And it's really the issue that's always divided us. Slavery. Southern states are furious. They're ready to break away. Some. Because they are afraid that slavery is going to go away. That's what they're afraid of. In fact, South Carolina actually decides to break away. A lot of you don't realize that, but they actually decided to break away. Flat out. They're going to become an independent Republic of South Carolina. But the other states convinced them not to do it. So they met in Nashville. We're going to break away. Now, I don't know if you remember this from Andrew Jackson, but over the nullification crisis, South Carolina, back then, talked about breaking away from the United States. And Andrew Jackson said, no, you're not allowed to. It's called the Force Bill. And he said, you have to obey federal law, and if you don't, we can force you to do it. Not only that, but he issued a proclamation that said, If you break away, you're not allowed to do that. If you break away, we will force you to come back. So when they're talking about secession at this convention in the summer of 1850, they know that secession means war. So in 1850, we're already talking about going to war with each other. Now, by the way, this whole idea of whether a state can break away or not, I mean, this is a fundamental issue that hadn't been completely resolved. Some people argue that we were a country that was comprised of states that are just kind of voluntarily hanging out together. A loose confederation, if you will. And that's how we began, way back in 1783. Others will say, but that changed with the Constitution. The Constitution completely changed all of that. That the Constitution is we the people. I mean, that's the opening words. We the people, not we the states. So we the people are Americans. We happen to live in states, just like we live in counties and we live in cities and towns. But we're Americans first. In other words, let's say Florida decided to break away. Well, Florida can't just break away from the U.S. because you in Georgia, you own part of Florida. Your money has gone to build highways in Florida. Your money has gone to build canals in Florida. Florida is as much yours as Georgia is mine. So if I'm here in Florida, which is where I'm at right this second, and I get really mad at the United States, I don't get to take my toys and go home. The argument is I could leave. I could go move to England. I could move to Scotland. But I don't get to take Florida with me. Florida belongs to all Americans. Florida isn't just mine. Florida is everybody. And so there is still a debate over this. I mean, that is still not clear. But everybody does know, no matter how you feel about it, if a state breaks away, that's what we mean by secession, then it's going to be war. So that's the debate now. And of course, the reason they're doing that is because of slavery. So even though, yes, that's what when people talk about states' rights, that's what they're talking about. The right of a state to decide for themselves whether or not to have slaves. A right of a state whether or not to break away or not. But slavery is still that hub. That is the issue. So things, in other words, are getting really, really serious. We're talking about Americans getting ready to kill other Americans. This is as bad as it gets. This is as divided as it gets. So this is the moment when a president is supposed to step in and save the day. So where is the president? Well, by this point, James Polk, he's done. Some people thought that might have been a little too convenient. And there's always been these rumors for years that maybe Zachary Taylor didn't die of food poisoning. Maybe he was murdered of just simply poisoning. Maybe his food was actually poisoned. And in fact, that rumor has been going on for over a century. Finally, in 1989, he was dug up. His family said, dig him up. And they dug him up, and they tested his hair and his bones for various poisons, and the tests were inconclusive. More than likely, Zachary Taylor was not poisoned, but there are still people to this day that still think that he was poisoned. In other words, isn't it worth it for one person to die so that the rest of the country can live? I mean, that would be the argument. Anyway, this is one of those historical gossips. What Millard Fillmore did was he brought in a guy named Henry Clay. Now, we haven't talked about Henry Clay because since I didn't do the Jackson lecture. That's usually when I talk about Henry Clay. Let me give you a little background on Henry Clay. Henry Clay was born in Virginia, but he became a senator from Kentucky. And Henry Clay was known as the Great Compromise. He came up with the 1820 Missouri Compromise, where we avoided war. I mean, that was what he was known as. He was good at coming up with political deals. He ran for president in 1824, lost, became Secretary of State. That's one of the things that made Andrew Jackson really mad. He ran for president several more times. Henry Clay is the one that sort of tried to get Andrew Jackson to go after the National Bank. Of course, that backfired because Andrew Jackson won, and he became very popular. So Henry Clay's been around for a while. Henry Clay is in retirement. In fact, he's about to die. Millard Fillmore convinces Henry Clay to come back to D.C. to work out a deal. And this was Henry Clay's plan. And we know it as the Compromise of 1850. Number one, California's a free state. Everyone knows that's going to be the case. Slavery was used primarily for cash crop agriculture. things like tobacco, sugar, rice, and especially cotton. You're not doing that in California. In fact, at this time, California was not much of an agricultural state. It would take Chinese immigrants coming in and irrigating California. Chinese immigrants are why California today is a major agricultural state. But at this point, it wasn't. Plus, you got to take slaves all the way across the country over the Rocky Mountains. It just doesn't make sense. They're not doing it. So everybody knows California is going to be a free state. So that's number one. That's off the table. There it is. Number two, slavery will remain in Washington, D.C. But public punishments and those public slave markets, those will go away. Because when it really comes down to it, that's the part that everybody didn't like, the whipping of slaves in public, the selling of people in public. Those will go away in D.C. So again, even though today we find all of this ugly, because obviously slavery is horrible, but at the time, that's a real compromise. You keep slavery, but you don't get to do everything that you normally get to do. So it's a true compromise. Number three, there's still some other territory. There's the Utah territory. There's the New Mexico territory. So the idea is that in areas like that, and in other areas, that when anytime other areas become states, the people of those states will decide whether or not to be slave or free. We call that popular meaning people, sovereignty. The people will decide. It won't be Congress deciding, which is what the South doesn't want. Again, it's another compromise. And finally, number four, there will be some tougher fugitive slave laws. So in the end, everyone gets some of what they want, but nobody gets everything they want. That's real politics. That's how it works. In other words, this is good politics. This is a good compromise. And to get on my political soapbox for 2 seconds, this is the thing that we seem today to not be able to do. Nobody seems to be able to do this anymore. And I think that's not good. Because as you'll see, by 1860, we won't be able to do this anymore. We won't be able to compromise anymore. And when that happens, war happens. So compromise is a good thing. Everybody thinks, oh, I got to compromise. No, compromise is good. You have to do it. It's the only way to get through. Okay, so compromise 1850 goes through. We've avoided war. Good. But there's a reaction to it. In Georgia, I do try to mention Georgia as much as I can, but actually, even if we weren't in Georgia, I would still mention this. Georgia takes the lead on this. Georgia, major slave state at this point, obviously. They react to this. And their state legislature issues a resolution. And they agree. They accept the compromise. They were a part of it. They say, yes, we agreed to it. We voted for it. But those fugitive slave laws better be enforced. You better not, meaning Congress, you better not abolish slavery in Washington, D.C. And if there's another area of the country that is good for slavery, that's what I mean by another slave area, because slavery isn't going to be in Washington State. Slavery is only going to be in the southern region. So let's say maybe it's Kansas. Maybe it's part of New Mexico. If another area that would be good for slavery is up for statehood, Congress better allow that, through popular sovereignty. If not, because, they would argue we gave up California. There is an imbalance. We gave that up. So next time, you better let it be a slave state. You better not stop it. If you don't do any of these things, if you renege on these deals, that will mean secession, which of course means war. So Georgia is threatening war. Hey, you don't do this, we're going to go to war. That becomes the stance of the entire South, because all the other southern slave states passed similar resolutions. Georgia was the first one, but everybody else does the same thing. So we are still being held together. But think about you got like a shirt, and you're pulling your shirt apart, and you got the seams on your sleeves. Those seams are just barely hanging on now. So we're still together as a united nation, but just barely. And so the next time there's a big issue, there's a really good chance that we're going to break apart. And breaking apart means we're going to start killing each other. This is really serious. But we've averted that one last time. Now, one issue that we need to talk about It's really kind of a whole separate lecture, but we're going to do it together as one big lecture here. So if you want to hit pause and come back later, go for it. I know it's already been a while. Um, but another, so don't you wish you could hit pause on me all the time? Let's just hit pause on Dr. Nelson. Okay, let's go have lunch for a while. See, now you get to do that. You get to shut me up whenever you feel like it. Okay. If you've come back, great. Sorry. One of the big issues is this. Slavery is still here. The persistence of slavery is in many ways another issue. It's another issue. You know, and in fact, if you will, it's the underlying issue. The reason I talk about the persistence of slavery is that the founding fathers, or brothers, whatever you want to call them, if they were still alive in 1850, Jefferson, Adams, Washington, Hamilton, Monroe, Franklin, they would have been shocked that in 1850 there were still slaves. All of them assumed that slavery would have gone away. All of them. That was what they all said. It will eventually die out. Either slaves will just die out and go away, or people will just free them, and we just won't need slaves anymore. That will just die a natural death, if you will. In fact, if you read the Constitution, slavery is actually mentioned 3 times in the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't actually allow for slavery officially, but it does mention slavery 3 times. One of those times is it says specifically that in 1808, the importation of slavery will stop. In other words, we won't bring slaves into this country anymore after 1808. And so again, that was on purpose. The thought was, okay, that's 20 years from now, from when they created the Constitution. That's 20 years from now. So you can bring slaves in for 20 years. And then over time, again, the number of slaves will decrease. And either, again, they will all die out, or people will just free them. And that will be the end of it. And they assumed by 1850 it would have been gone. But of course, in 1850, it's not gone, is it? In fact, it's expanding. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's not going anywhere. It used to just be about 6 states. Now it's in 16 states. And it's going to be even more states before. I mean, they try to make it in California. So slavery has not withered away. It has grown. So it's very different from what the founding fathers would have thought. So again, the persistence of slavery, the fact that slavery is still around, is really a major part of why we, the build-up to the Civil War. By the way, this image you're looking at is a great image. This is from Florida. It's one of the only images we have in Florida of a slave. This is a woman in Jefferson County, Florida, actually just outside of Monticello, Florida. She was a slave that would have lived in a plantation. In fact, I've forgotten her name, but we actually know who her name is. She's actually, we have the records of this person. The fact that there's a portrait of a slave tells you a lot. Photography was very, very expensive in the 1840s and 1850s. So, you didn't just take photos of anything. There's a reason why you don't see many photos of horses. You don't see many photos of wagons. It's usually photos told you stories. That slave would have rocked you to sleep. There would have been emotion there, And even though that woman would have wanted to be free, there still would have been emotional attachment there, which makes slavery very complex. A lot of times when people say, owners loved their slaves, and you think, no, they didn't. Well, in their own weird way, they did sometimes. In the same way a parent who might beat and abuse their child still will say, not a good thing, but, anyway, enough of that. So this is, I was trying to explain my images, so I think it's a great image. So how do we go from slavery disappearing to slavery growing? Well, that has to do with this. If I was to ask everybody, which obviously I can't sitting at home, but if I was to ask the entire class, who invented the cotton gin? I bet every one of you would say Eli Whitney. Everybody knows that Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. Why do we all know that? Because we are all taught that. That is one of those little facts we all have to learn. Well, it really doesn't matter that Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. It's funny that we all know that. He did invent it, by the way. He was from Connecticut. He came down to Georgia because his brother was working down here. His brother was trying to get him to buy a plantation. He decided not to do that. But he watched as people were picking cotton. He noticed that it was very time-consuming. In fact, cotton, and this is, obviously cotton. Cotton wasn't very valuable in the 1790s. It wasn't the main crop. The main crop were things like tobacco, rice, sugar, indigo. Indigo is a plant that you can make dye from. That was what you made money from. Cotton was just a small-scale crop. There were two types of cotton, by the way, back then. There was this cotton that you see in this image. This is the cotton you see grown around Georgia, for instance. This is called short staple cotton. The fibers are very short. Um, and then there's Sea Island cotton. It's also known as long staple cotton. The cotton threads are very long and fine. Sea Island cotton is actually better cotton. And if you're going to make money for cotton, that's the kind of cotton you grew back then, the Sea Island cotton. But there's a problem with Sea Island cotton. It's very hard to grow. Very hard. And as the name implies, you can only grow it on the Sea Islands, the barrier islands, islands like Jekyll Island, or St. Simon's Island, or Sapelo Island, And you can grow it right on the coast, maybe 20 miles inland. Here in Bainbridge, or here in Quincy where I'm at, you can't grow Sea Island cotton. But you can grow this kind of cotton. The problem with this kind of cotton, though, is if any of you have ever picked it, one thing, it just is hard. I mean, it makes your fingers bleed. It's hard to get out of there. And then when you get that cotton boll, it has a lot of junk in it, leaves and trash and seeds in it. And it's hard to get all that out. Before the cotton gin, you had to literally do it by hand. Very time-consuming. And it's not worth the time and effort to do it. It just isn't worth it. So you're not going to make much money from it. That's where the cotton gin comes in. The cotton gin basically takes that cotton, you dump it in there, and it pulls out all the trash. It also pulls out the seeds, and you get this nice lint cotton that then you can send off to market to sell in big bales to be turned into threads and clothing and all that. Now you might think, well, how does this machine make slaves more important? Because you would think that this would mean slaves aren't as important because you don't need as many slaves when you got a cotton gin. It actually has the opposite effect. For one thing, to be able to get the cotton to send to the cotton gin, that means you have to grow the cotton. And of course, if you're going to make money at it, you're going to grow more cotton. So what happens is everybody starts growing more cotton. But of course, you need slaves to clear the fields, to plant the cotton, to take care of the cotton, to tend to the cotton, then to pick the cotton, then to take it to the cotton mills. In fact, slaves often were used at these cotton gins anyway. It actually had the opposite effect of what you might think. Cotton gin guaranteed that slaves aren't going away. That's why Eli Whitney is so important. It's not the cotton gin himself, it's the effect of the cotton gin. It made cotton very valuable. Cotton was easier to grow than some of these other crops, and it can grow in a larger area than could tobacco, sugar, indigo. And so everybody started growing cotton now because of this. But remember, there's an 1808 deadline. This is 1793. That means you have barely 15 years to import slaves. We see a huge importation of slaves between 1793 and 1808. So we see an explosion of slavery because of cotton gin. And of course, we're going to still see some smuggling of cotton before. Okay, so we can really see why 1850 slavery is so important. It goes back to 1790s with the cotton gin. Now I'm not going to test you directly on the numbers, so I want you to listen, but you don't have to. If you are writing stuff down, you don't necessarily have to write all these numbers down. Sorry, I had to take a drink. Okay. Now, by 1850, slavery is pretty much in what we would call the South, which is really the Southeast. It's not the Southwest, the Southeast, but the South. But everybody's tied to it. That's one thing I do want to make clear. Not to excuse the South by no means. Because I'm going to be really tough on the South, more than I have already been. But everybody's hands are dirty with this. Everybody. Even today, a lot of those big companies out there rose to power back in the 1800s because they benefited from slave labor. Think about textile mills up in Massachusetts. They're getting nice, cheap cotton, which means if the stuff's cheaper, they can make more profit when they sell it. Well, how are they getting all that cheap cotton? They're getting it from slaves down south. It's all interconnected. So everybody's hands are dirty with this. But slavery itself is connected down south, concentrated in the south. Now, between 1850 and 1860, there are about 12 million people. Okay, 8 million people are white, and of course that matters because slavery is, if you're black, you're a slave. If you're white, you're not a slave. So that means there's about 4 million slaves. In other words, 4 million people who are considered black, even if they don't always look black. Because back then, one drop of African blood made you black. Doesn't matter whether you're, you know, most of your family's white. If you had some black heritage and it was known that you were partly African, you would have been a slave. Now, a lot of times when people argue against the Civil War being over slavery, and people do make that argument to this day, one of the arguments they make is that not everybody in the South owned slaves, implying that people who fought in the Civil War, many of them would not have been slave owners, and therefore they're not fighting for slavery. There is a little bit of truth to that. Not everybody fought in the Confederacy were fighting for slavery. Sometimes they were fighting for protection of their homes. But I would make the argument that most really are fighting for slavery. But in a moment, it'll look like I'm arguing the opposite, because we can break these numbers down pretty far. Because in the South, there were only about 400,000 slave owners out of 8 million possible slave owners. But of course, that 8 million includes kids, it includes women who weren't slave owners. But we can make that number 400,000 a little bit bigger. You know, we can maybe even say 2 million are directly connected to it. Because, you know, that would include wives. That would also include maybe supervisors, overseers, sons that are over 18 that are helping to run the plantation. So I think we can safely say 2 million, you know. Which, if we can even say 3 million. That still leaves 5 to 6 million people who are not slave owners but are free. That's a lot of people. I can make the number even smaller, though. Let's start running through some of the numbers. So most whites, and again, I'm using white and black because we kind of have to, because slavery is about white and black. Most whites, white Southern, were small farmers and didn't own slaves at all. Again, 5 to 6 million were that group right there. Most slave owners were not planters. Everybody always thinks slave owners look like Gone with the Wind. Big Terra plantation with 100 slaves and huge acreage. That's not the reality of most slave owners. Most slave owners were not planters. Planters was an actual status. You know, to be a planter, you know, I know most of you are probably thinking the peanuts, but to be a planter, that meant you owned 5 to 800 acres or more. In other words, a bunch of land. And you owned 30 or more slaves. Now, a lot of people think 30 slaves, that doesn't sound like much. If you had 30 slaves, you were rich. You were well off. Most plantations were 30 to 40 slaves. That was, I mean, you were a millionaire. Slaves in 1809, I'll show you a graph in a little bit. But in 1809, slaves were worth about $40,000. That's in 1809. 1850, they were actually worth more than that. So think about having 30 slaves. You can do the math. It's over $1 million. So just in slaves alone, $1 million we're talking about. Plus the price of the land, plus the money you're making from the cotton and other stuff you're growing. These guys were rich. So owning 30 slaves, you were a millionaire, or the equivalent of a millionaire today. You know, so you were rich. Most slave owners weren't that. In fact, most slave owners only own 1 to 9 slaves. I might actually test you on just so you know, I may test you. I may have a question that says, you know, were most people slave owners? No. Most slave owners, true or false, most slave owners own 1 to 9 slaves. That might be a question. So, you know, because I did just that. We're going to test your numbers, and I might test you on that number. So most slave owners own 1 to 9. Now the rest of the numbers, I promise I won't test you on. Only 25,000 owned 30 slaves or more. In other words, only 25,000 were planters. I'm going to come back to that number in just a moment. Only 10,000 owned 50 slaves or more. Only 2,300 owned 100 slaves or more. Only 14 people that we know of in the 1800s. Now, this doesn't count further back. We're only talking in the 1850s now. But only 14 people owned 500 slaves or more. And only one person, in fact, we can name the person. We know who he is, George Hampton of Mississippi. Only one person owned more than 1,000 slaves. Think about that, though. That's the size of some of our small towns in this area. I mean, gosh, that might be Wiggum. That might be Climax right there. That probably is Attapulgis right there. That's a lot of people. Um, this guy would have been one of the richest. In fact, I just looked it up. That would be about 3 Attapulgises, just to give you an example, because the official population of Attapulgis is 446. So, anyway, he would have been one of the richest people in the country. Now, let's go back to that 25,000 for a little bit. That's a key number. Those are key people. Those people ran everything. You know, the presidents we're talking about, they're one of those 25,000. Those 25,000 were the governors. Those 25,000 were the legislators. Those 25,000 were the members of Congress. Those 25,000 were the newspaper editors. Those 25,000 were the judges. Those 25,000 were the people that ran everything. They made the law, and they enforced the law. They controlled what you knew and what you didn't know. Imagine you're a small farmer living in Decatur County in 1851. What do you know about the world? You don't have TV, you don't have radio, you don't have internet. The only newspaper you get, if you can read, is a newspaper published by a slave owner. That's it. That's all you get. There's no public library. There's no community colleges to go through to hear people like me talking to you. Thank goodness for you back then. But seriously, I mean, you really don't know much of what's going on in the greater world. Your whole world is your little farm and what you've been told about the rest of the world. And who's doing the telling? 25,000. Think about today. What do you know about Iraq right now? I know I have a couple of veterans in my class. A couple of you do know about Iraq because you've been there. But everybody else, what do you know about Iraq? What do you know about Afghanistan? Why are we there at war today? Well, you know what you've seen on CNN, what you've seen on Fox, what you've heard President Bush or President Obama say, or what you've heard Senator McCain say, or Senator Ryan say. Now I don't think they've been lying to us. I'm not making that claim, but what I'm getting at is even today, most of us, we know about the world from what we see in the media and what we hear our leaders tell us. In 1851, the leaders were the slave owners. They controlled the media. So this is one of the reasons why even non-slave owners are going to fight in the Confederacy. Because they've been told that if slaves are freed, they're going to kill everybody. If slaves are freed, women are going to be raped. If slaves are freed, those freed people are going to turn around and kill us and beat us all up and maybe even enslave us. And you're going to believe it. Now, we know that didn't happen. Now, in 1851, they've been told this. And they believe it. That's one of the reasons why even non-slave owners are going to fight for the Confederacy. Not the only reason, but it is one of the reasons. The other reason, and usually I have a nice big class discussion about this. I'm sad that I have to do this online, but I want you to really think about this. Okay. Now, what I usually would ask everybody, so I want you to just think about this in your own head. Who among you thinks you're going to be a millionaire? Now, I know we all want to be a millionaire. We all want to be rich. But which one of you really thinks you're going to be a millionaire? Really? Usually one or two students will raise their hand, and that's usually it. Because no one really thinks you're... I know I'm not going to be a millionaire. I went into the wrong business to become a millionaire. But we all want to be, of course. Okay. So, let's imagine you were a millionaire. Let's hit pause on that for a moment. Imagine you are a millionaire. What do you buy? Let's say you win a lottery. You win, $100 million. A ton of money. Okay, and let's imagine you've paid off all your taxes. You've given money to your family. You've given money to your church. In other words, you've done all the good guy stuff. Now you're a good guy. You've done the good stuff. You still got $50 million left over. What are you doing with it? And obviously you can't answer me, but I bet most of you would do things like buy a big house, buy a lot of fun stuff, a bunch of toys, a boat, nice cars. You're probably not buying a rusty old truck. You're probably not living in a trailer. You're going to buy, a bunch of land so you can go hunting or fishing, or you're going to, travel the world. You might buy a tropical island. In other words, there are things that symbolize being rich, not working, you know, traveling, doing what you want, living in a big house, having big screen TVs and nice cars and maybe nice jewelry and nice clothing and not having to work. And, there are what we call status symbols. We have status symbols. It's no fun being rich unless you can show it off. And nobody ever admits that they're showing it off, but we are. That's why we buy nice cars. A beat-up old car gets you to this place the same way a nice car does. But boy, driving around a nice car is fun because everybody sees you with a nice car. It's a status symbol. I remember seeing ads on TV, for instance, like retirement companies. And I remember one ad in particular a few years back showed a woman walking on the beach. She had a pina colada in her hand. She was walking on the beach, clearly in the Caribbean, and then she lies down in a hammock, and then the camera pulls back, and you see this just this big deserted island. It's just her. And then it said, AIG, we have your future protected. In other words, they say if you go with us for retirement, you're going to be rich when you retire. They didn't have to say that, though. All they had to do was show a woman walking on the beach with a pina colada in her hand. We got it. All that stuff symbolized being rich, symbolized making it. Back in the 1850s, making it, being rich, meant you didn't have to work with your hands, you owned a lot of land, and you owned slaves. That was a status symbol. So, knowing that now, let me ask you again, another question. So, most of you, if not all of you, don't think you're going to be millionaires, right? You all want to be, but nobody thinks you're going to be a millionaire, except for maybe one or two of you. Imagine if I, God forbid, I am in charge, and I have passed a law that says none of you can be millionaires. How many of you are mad at me? And I bet a lot of you are mad at me. And I would ask, why? You don't think you're going to be a millionaire, so why are you mad at me? And the answer would be, but I could be a millionaire. I probably won't be, but I could be. And you've taken away my hope. We might call that the American dream. The American dream is a dream. Most of you aren't going to be president. Most of you aren't going to be millionaires. But you can dream. You do got a shot at it. You might be president. You might be a millionaire. You have a dream. And by saying you're not allowed to be, I've just taken away your dream. Now, back to 1851, for a lot of people, that dream was owning slaves. Today we would consider that a nightmare. But at the time, that was a dream for people. To them, for us, it's winning the lottery. It's going on American Idol, becoming a famous music star. It's writing that best-selling novel, whatever. Back then, it was owning slaves. That's what you did with your money. You made a lot of money, you bought slaves, and you made more money. So, in addition to the fear of freed slaves, for a lot of even non-slave owners, if somebody said, well, I'm going to outlaw slavery, that would be like me saying, you're not allowed to be a millionaire anymore. Because slavery was the path to power. Slavery was the path to riches. So, if you think of the Civil War, it's not just 25,000 very, very rich, very, very powerful people protecting their interests. This is a rich man's war. But it was also a poor man's fight. Because a lot of people who didn't own slaves wanted to own slaves. They wanted their children to own slaves. And they were willing to fight for it. In fact, one time I asked a question, what if I passed a law and it said none of you could be a millionaire? How would you feel? And I remember a student spoke up and said, I'd shoot you. He wasn't joking. And he proved my point. When you're talking about millions of dollars, sadly, for some people, that's killing money. Not for me, but for some people, that's killing money. And people were willing to kill and die over this issue. That's not the only explanation for why people fought the Civil War. but it is a huge one, and it does help you understand the time period. And again, this is a graphic I got not too long ago, because slavery still exists today. It's not the same thing as in the 1850s, but there are still slaves today. There are sex slaves out there. There's even slaves right here in this country, people who are not free. Well, a lot of people are trapped into this country by ruthless people, and then they're slaves. In fact, you can buy slaves in certain parts of the world for $90. 1809, it'll cost you $40,000. Just give you, again, trying to give you a difference of what kind of money we used to be talking about here. Okay, so I want to set the demographics. Let's start talking about the conditions of what slavery was like. There is a category called free blacks. That's the actual legal term that was used at the time. By the way, this is a photograph of a free black family. Actually, the only known image of a free black wedding, obviously before the Civil War, because we wouldn't use the term free blacks after the Civil War. That's what this is actually from North Carolina. There were indeed free blacks, mostly in Virginia and North Carolina, two of the oldest slave states. A lot of these were what we would have called mulatto, which is a mix of European and African. In many cases, free blacks were free because they literally were children of plantation owners, slave owners, and so therefore they were freed for that reason. In some cases, they were freed as a reward. Maybe they did something great, and the slave owner freed them. Or in some cases, the slave owner, George Washington freed a slave, for instance, way back in 1799. And these might be the product of somebody who was freed for that reason. Robert E. Lee. You always hear the rumor that Robert E. Lee never owned slaves. That's actually not true. Robert E. Lee actually did own slaves. He actually inherited a bunch of slaves from his father-in-law when his father-in-law died. And his father-in-law actually, in the will, said that, Robert E. Lee has to free the slaves. And he didn't. Later, he was forced by court to do so. So, there were people who, in their will, freed slaves or, did it out of goodness. So we do see free slaves, freed blacks, in other words. And, of course, they would have children, so those children would be then born free. But the problem is that, they weren't citizens. They couldn't vote. They really couldn't own land. They really had very few rights at all. They tended to be urban, meaning they tended to live in cities. They tended to do very low-paying jobs. They were treated very poorly. In fact, one of the problems was that the assumption was that they were slaves. I mean, if you saw somebody black, you think, oh, well, they're slaves. That's the presumption. They had to constantly prove that they were free. We do know for a fact a lot of these free blacks wound up back in slavery. Florida is an excellent example. Florida was Spanish until 1821. Under Spanish control, actually, they encouraged the freeing of slaves. So you had a huge, about 40,000 free blacks in Florida when Florida became U.S. territory in 1821. A lot of them immediately left Florida and went down to Cuba and other areas of Spain, of the Spanish Empire. But a lot of them stayed. And in fact, I've even personally done some of this research, looking at some of these individuals. And from 1821 to, say, 1841, a lot of them lined up back in slavery. Many of them had never been slaves. They were born free. So we can see the lives of free blacks weren't that nice. Now, one argument you do sometimes hear is you'll hear like, oh, blacks owned other blacks as slaves, which is true. I don't know why that's, it's almost as though that makes slavery okay. I don't know why they make that argument, but it is partly true. We do see some. In fact, we even see some genuine slave owners. What I mean by that is, in the way that you might think of a slave owner, a plantation owner. One of the more famous plantations is called Kingsley Plantation down in Florida. It's a national park run by a guy named Zephaniah Kingsley, who was married to an African woman who we know as Anna Kingsley. He married her in Africa. She was never a slave. And she was brought to Spanish Florida, and then he died in the 1830s after Florida was already part of the U.S. And she inherited his plantation. She ran the plantation, had over 200 slaves. And for all intents and purposes, seemed to be a pretty cruel slave owner. But even she eventually had to run away. And she escaped down to Haiti for a long time and eventually came back to the U.S. They had to come back to New York, and she died very, very poor. So even in those few cases where we see African Americans as real slave owners, even in their cases, the lives were pretty rough. Most black slave owners, though, again, we can document about 3,600. Most of them own their own family. For whatever, let's say I'm a slave, and for whatever reason I'm free, but my wife or my mom or my dad or my son is still a slave. I may work out a deal where I buy them, so that then I control them, you know. And I'm not going to use them as a slave. I'm protecting. We're going to live as a family, but legally speaking, I own them, if you will. You know, so it's a slightly misleading number when you know, but this is why most slaves were used. I mean, this is the reality of life for the vast majority of slaves, farm working, primarily by 1850 growing to cotton. This is actually right after slavery. This is actually from Thomas County, Georgia. These are people who are now free, but doing the same work they did as slaves. And you can tell they're ready for the photographs because they're kind of dressed up. If you see them, they're dressed a little bit nicer than they probably would have. That this is clearly a posed photograph. But it is nice that you see men, women, and children, because all of them would have been used as workers. Now, of course, if you own slaves, you have to house your slaves. So you would have slave cabins, and you would have provided those. But that would have been about all you would have provided as a slave owner. One thing you got to keep in mind when we talk about slavery, we often talk about owners fed the slaves. Owners did this for slaves. We got to switch that around. The reality is slaves provided everything. Slaves provided the food. Slaves provided the clothing. You know, that's the whole purpose of having a slave, is that the slave does it for you. You know, you don't work for your slaves work for you. So almost beyond the basic cabin, which probably would have been slave built, everything else they would have had to provide anyway. You know, even if it's a brand new slave, furniture, bedding, and of course it's ironic. You know, you think of you look at the records of property and stuff, and the mattresses and pillows were almost always used hay or pine straw. They never used cotton because cotton was money, so you're not going to waste your money on a slave. But these are just very typical slave cabins at the time. Entire family would have lived here. If they were lucky, they would have had an indoor fireplace. That they weren't always lucky. This is probably one of the more famous ones. This is at Kingsley Plantation in Jacksonville, Florida. These are some of the oldest slave cabins that still exist today. And that one that you're looking at has been partly restored. You can see they've added a brand new roof to it. But most still stand today. This is the same cabin right after the Civil War. Here's the cabin in South Carolina. Here in Georgia. North Carolina. It's interesting about this part of Georgia and even of Florida is that we still see slave cabins in some of the larger land properties and such. A lot of these will later become sharecropper cabins after the Civil War. So, slavery. It's a system you have to control. And it is a system controlled by violence. Not every slave owner were incredibly violent, but you can't control people without violence. You and I are controlled by violence. A little bit. There's a reason why we have a military. There's a reason why we have police forces with guns on their belts. You know, break the law and resist arrest. You will be facing a little bit of violence. That's normal. You know, every society, you has to have some violence. You know, what makes us a good country is that we minimize as much as we can the use of violence. Hopefully, that's what we do. Slavery also had the threat of violence there. You know, and not every slave owner beat their slaves. In fact, a lot of slave owners bragged about the fact that they never have to beat their slaves. You know, in the same way parents like to brag, I never have to spank my child. I have a perfect child. I've trained my child well. But every single slave owner would have fought for the right to punish their slave. Whipping, beating, branding, even in some cases killing. Although a lot of communities did have laws against truly cruel punishment, it still happened. Again, this goes all the way back to indentured servitude. I mean, that was the punishment back then. That goes back to the early days of slavery. It's still there. There's other ways to control, though. It's not all about violence. Violence is kind of the last resort. It's there. Education. Teach slaves in the very beginning that this is normal, that this is okay, to be docile, to be subservient. That you can't help it. You're just inferior. That's how God made it. You know, brainwashing is another word for that. I'm going to come back to the word rape in just a moment. That is a very loaded word, and I do use it on purpose. Selling somebody down the river. That's a euphemism, meaning the Mississippi River. That refers to two things. One is slavery wasn't the same throughout the South. The further south you went, the worse it got. It was hotter, muggier, buggier. You also got newer slave owners. If you think about it, Florida wasn't a state till 1845. Alabama, it comes in really late. Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. These were brand new states. I mean, they were barely around 15 years when the Civil War began. You get a lot of new slave owners in these areas, and they do tend to be crueler. They tend to be tougher slave owners. You get up into Virginia and Maryland and Tennessee, the relationship between slaves and owners tends to be a little bit better. The slave owners didn't feel like they had as much to prove, if you will. Plus, it's a little bit cooler there. To sell somebody down the river, meaning to sell them further south, that was a real punishment because their life was going to get a whole lot worse. But it also refers to something else. Let's imagine you're a slave, and you keep disobeying. So I'm going to punish you. Instead of beating you or something, because you're a good slave, I don't want to take the chance of hurting you. I might just threaten to sell your wife or your husband or your child to some other slave owner. And we would call that selling down the river. You would never see that person ever again, and you can never protect that person. You don't know what's going to happen to that person. Think about if you have a child. Think about that, or a brother, or a sister, or a mom, or a dad. Imagine never, ever, ever, ever seeing that person ever again because of something you did. If that's the case, you're probably going to change your behavior. If for nothing else to save them, it's very effective psychological punishment. Incredibly cruel, and yet it works. So that was something that was often threatened. That's another control. Slave patrol. There wasn't many sheriffs back then. There was no police forces back then. The slave owners provided the police. They called it slave patrols. Every slave owner was supposed to, at least once a month, if not more often, go out at night, make sure slaves weren't doing stuff they weren't supposed to. It's kind of the beginning of what later will become things like the Klan. This is the origins of that. This is not the Klan, but this is what will become the Klan after the Civil War. Now, I use the word rape, and I am, again, using that word on purpose. If you're a slave, you don't have choice. If you're a slave, you are property. So if a slave owner had sex with you, you really can't say yes or no. You may have said yes. We don't know that historically for the most part. All we know is somebody had sex with you and you were property. Unless we know otherwise, the only word you can use for that is rape. Rape refers to somebody not having the ability to say yes or no. You know, if you don't have a decision on whether someone has sex with you or not, then it's rape. You know, and so if you're a slave, technically it's rape. You know? And we know. I mean, 80% of African Americans today have at least a little bit European heritage. You know, if you look at DNA, we know there was a lot of racial mixing. Some of that might have been consensual, though. It wouldn't all have been rape, of course. A lot of that would have been, we would have seen interracial relationships. Even before the Civil War, we do see some real interracial relationships. We see a lot after the Civil War. So that's not all because of slavery, of course. But we do know there was a lot of miscegenation. That's the old word for racial mixing. That was what they used to call it. An interesting, one of the reasons we know so much about slavery is because a lot of people traveled from places like New York or England or Scotland or Germany. They came to the South and they would stay with plantation owners. And then they would go back home and they would write books about what they saw. We have literally hundreds of these travel books about the South. And they're very similar what they say. And one of the things they talk about is going to a plantation. Maybe a plantation with a guy with red hair. And they go to that plantation and they see all these red-haired children who are slaves running around. And it's very clear what's going on. But nobody talks about it. This is why so many women were anti-slavery. For them, a lot of women, to them, they called it legal prostitution. Because they knew that that was, and this is very crude, that was one of the perks, quote-unquote perks of owning slaves. Because they couldn't say that. But that could also be a punishment as well. So that's why I do use that word, even though it may not be accurate for every instance, but we do. And we also know sometimes it would have been cruel and violent as well. This is one of the few photographs we have of the product of slave punishment. This is a former slave down in New Orleans, one of the first places to be freed during the Civil War. And he was in his 40s when this photograph was taken by a guy named Matthew Brady. This is a whipping that he suffered back when he was in his 20s. So 20 years later, look at that scarring. You know, a lot of people say, well, I don't care if they whipped me or not. I wouldn't have done all this stuff. Yes, you would have. One whipping could have cut open a hole big enough to see your ribs in some cases. Many people died from being whipped. One whipping is usually all it took. It was unfortunately very, very effective control. There were laws about what slaves could and couldn't do. We called them slave codes. They couldn't eat without whites present. In other words, they did, but they weren't supposed to. They might be plotting revenge. You couldn't own property. How could property own other property? You couldn't own guns, although we do know slaves sometimes did go hunting and stuff. You weren't supposed to marry legally. You did marry. A lot of times they married themselves. Sometimes owners would even force people into marriages, but they weren't legal marriages. In other words, you could be broken up at any point. There was no government enforcement of that marriage. You couldn't leave. Obviously, you're a slave. You couldn't disobey any white person. It doesn't matter if it's a 3-year-old kid or an 80-year-old woman. You couldn't disobey any white person. And you couldn't learn to read. That one seems to be kind of odd, but we've already talked about this one. Learning is power. So we don't want you reading, if you're a slave, if you're a slave and I'm a slave owner, we don't want you reading the Declaration of Independence that says all men are created equal. We don't want you necessarily reading the Bible for yourself. Because yes, the Bible has slavery in it, but it also talks about freeing people. Think of Moses. Free my people. We don't want you reading that stuff. We want you reading only certain things in the Bible. We're going to tell you what to read or what to learn. We don't want you reading the fact that some Americans don't want slavery. We don't want you reading a census report that shows that over half the people of Mississippi, over half the people of South Carolina are slaves. That if slaves all rise up at once, nobody can stop them. We don't want you knowing that. Knowledge is power. And so this was a way for slave owners to control that power. It's a control of slaves, if you will. Slaves did resist, though. And a lot of times I think we forget how much they truly resisted. And they can do it in a lot of ways. At the bottom, you can see the more obvious ways. Murder, rebellion, even suicide, running away. But there's other subtle ways to do this. And I think a lot of times we forget this. We kind of think slaves were just passive. They didn't do much. And actually, nobody wanted to be a slave. They were constantly finding ways to sort of stretch out a little bit. You have your own culture, an African-American culture. They usually kept a lot of this hidden because they didn't want people knowing about it. That was theirs. That was something to protect. Sometimes when you're a kid, you do things you don't want your parents see. Not because it's bad, but that's just yours. It's something private. That was here. We'll talk more about that culture in just a second. You work slow. That's a kind of a form of protest. I'm not going to work real hard. I'm just a slave. I'm going to break tools. I'm going to destroy crops. I'm going to pretend I don't know much. Since knowledge is power, I don't want them to know that I know much. So I'm going to pretend to be ignorant, even when I'm not. The downside of some of this is that it starts to feed into racial stereotypes. In the 1870s and 1880s, a lot of white Americans thought of African Americans as lazy, as not smart, as not being hard workers, because they remember that some slaves behaved that way. What they didn't know, of course, was that was on purpose. That was, and so unfortunately, slave resistance feeds a little bit of some of those early racial stereotypes that we see after the Civil War. It's funny, we talk a lot about Southern food, and then we talk about soul food. I know here at this college we have a soul food lunch we do every February. Soul food, of course, is supposed to be black food. And when people say Southern food, they usually mean white food. And it's funny to me, as a white Southerner, because when I look at soul food, I just see my food. It's all Southern food. To me, Southern culture, whether you're talking about food or religion or music or language, Southern culture is African culture and British culture thrown together. You mix those two things together and you get the South. The South, we may have been segregated by slavery. We may have been segregated by the law. But we have always been integrated culturally. When the lights are out, we have been integrated. When we're eating off our plates, we have always been integrated. When we're playing music, we have always been integrated. Even when we didn't always realize it. Things like black-eyed peas, okra, both of them from Africa. In fact, the word for okra, one of the many African words for okra, is gumban, which is where we get the word gumbo from. In fact, it's not gumbo unless it has okra in it. Grits, which is made from Indian corn, of course, but the process of making grits is actually an African process, which I know I've said before. Peanuts. One of the many African words for peanuts is the word goober, or something very similar to the word goober. A lot of you don't realize, if you're not from the, if you've grown up your whole life in the South, you may not realize a lot of Southern things are very strange to everybody else. Boiled peanuts is one of those. Grits is one of those. Grits is starting to catch on in the rest of the country, but it's still considered very much a Southern thing. Um, but a lot of the stuff that's considered a Southern thing are really African things. You know, a lot of Southern cuisine is African cuisine. And of course, what it really is a mix of African and European. You know, and it still is to this day. Hence why I always think it's funny when we talk about soul food versus Southern food, when it's all the same food. The reason it's called soul food, by the way, is because as African Americans began to move out of the South, especially in the 20th century, they would miss the music from back home. The food from back home. The food for the soul, if you will. They started getting these soul food restaurants opening up in black neighborhoods in Chicago and New York. That's also where we get terms like country music from. The term country music was never used until Southerners, black and white, moved out of the South to move to big cities to work for factories in the 30s and 40s. And they wanted the music from back home, that good old country music that we used to listen to. Hence the term country music.